Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Hope you enjoyed a little pregame conversation there. But thank you all for joining us for today's coffee talk. My name is Sean O'Brien, president of QuickRate, and as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for joining us today for our next Coffee Talk installment. As Sean said, my name is Steve Huntington. I'm the Director of Analytics here at QuickRate and QwickAnalytics. Spent my entire career working with community banks all over the country and everything from strategic planning and valuation and M&A work to model design and maintenance. And I've been working with Sean here for over a decade now.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And we are pleased to welcome back our dear friend Paul Allen from Saltmarsh. Paul, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Steve, for having me. I enjoy meeting with you and talking a little bit about CECL and talking about some of the implementation issues and so forth. So honored and flattered to be able to be with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We are always our biggest crowds are when you're here. So we truly appreciate you joining us again. Just a little bit of information about Paul's firm. A couple of reminders before we get started. Certainly, throughout the presentation today, if you want to submit questions, please do that through the Q&A or the chat feature. We'll monitor those and try to take them in the midst of the conversation or certainly at the end. Secondly, we will be sending out a link to today's recording in addition to a copy of the slides. So, probably late Monday afternoon, Tuesday, but we will get those out to everyone. And as we've done here recently, we're just going to start off with a few polling questions. We hope you don't mind. Just kind of see where everyone's thinking just for this morning. But I'm going to go ahead and launch the first one. Again, similar to one we had earlier this week on Wednesday, are you budgeting for higher or lower earnings in 2024 or about the same? So we'll just give these, as we typically do, 30 to 45 seconds, and we'll share the results. And the results will be included in the information we provide in the email. Okay, we'll go ahead and this one just a second or two more. Share this. All right. So 49% lower, 32% about the same, and about 19% higher. So thank you for answering on that one. We'll go to the second question around forecasting. Are you forecasting any changes to your reserve this year? Yes or no? So just a okay. When this one, 57% said yes, 43% said no. Thank you again. And moving on to credit quality concerns. Whoops, I'm going to stop sharing that one. What areas, if any, of your loan portfolio has credit quality concerns as you look out into 2024? So you can check all that apply. Did we do? I think it says single choice there, but hopefully we can check all that apply.
With the radio buttons, it might just be a single choice, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Although I can't tell from, you won't let me vote again. But at least we'll find the biggest point of concern.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think certainly the focus for seems to be commercial real estate kind of across the country. As we talked about on Wednesday, kind of starting to spread beyond the urban areas, but let's go ahead and end this one. Share the results. Non-owner occupied CRE is at the top of the list, followed by C&I, and then one to four family. So thank you on that one. And the final question, just anticipating any charge-offs. Do you anticipate any charge-offs from your loan portfolio this year?
What if you only have good loans, Sean? We only have good loans, right?
That's a beautiful thing. Yeah, sorry on the single choice there. That's our apologies there. All right, so we'll give this one just a second or two more. And we'll go ahead and show evenly split, 50-50. So I mean, I think that's, kind of captures what, it's hard to get a sense of where everyone is headed, right? It's good. Feels like there's good, but there's the worry of bad, but certainly everything right now seems to be appearing pretty good. Okay, so I shared those. Let me stop sharing. Let's kind of get moving here. A quick question came in just about how many pools or segments people are using. Again, I'd say for the majority of our banks today, they're staying confined to the call report pools. I think when banks get in trouble or have higher concentrations, they, not for CECL, but they do want to have the ability to kind of get more granular. But I think for CECL, we're seeing those call report codes. Steve or Paul, are you seeing anything different? And Steve?
Yeah, you see a little bit of folks breaking segments out of pools when there are loans that they feel are potentially impaired or have significantly different risk characteristics. But I have to say that's sort of a one-off. I think for the most part, banks are trying to stay to the call report components, but there's always an exception here or there.
Yeah.
Steve, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, not at all. So of course we've got, the individually assessed area, but as far as custom pools that were, following all the historical trends on and using our, evaluating on a collective basis, but on a separate collective basis than the call report segments. The ones that I've seen the most frequently are, they're all not completely unique, but if you have a significant amount of participations, if you have a segment that has a good amount of government guaranteed balances that's changed over time. Now, we do have the ability to back out current levels of government guaranteed balances, but if you have an SBA portfolio that you just kind of want to completely keep separate from the call report buckets and sort of back it out historically, that's something that I've seen a handful of times. But we haven't seen any real systematic trends where one particular type of loan that's outside of the typical call report buckets we're seeing frequently more than others. It's just a little bit of a smattering here and there of individual ones based on their situation.
Perfect. All right. All right. So at this point, we got a couple of follow-up questions. Maybe we'll jump these before we get to Paul. When you say call report code, would that include subcategories within the broader buckets? I would say it's the call report codes, the FFIEC codes that we have in the CECLSolver. So there's certainly the potential for more granularity. But Steve, you want to?
Yeah, the way we decided on the when we say call report buckets for CECL purposes is the most detail that we can get from the call report that has balance information, charge-off information, and recovery information, right? The schedule RCC, which is where we see kind of all of our additive loan buckets, is not historically been a perfectly accurate. That level of granularity doesn't match perfectly apples to apples to charge-offs and recoveries in the asset quality part of the call report. And even if we have consistent balance data for, let's say, a memo item on the balance sheet, right? If we haven't been able to also get the same exact level of consistency in the asset quality data for that loan segment, there's nothing we can really do about it. We can't, for purposes of a CECLSolver, just balances doesn't help us. What we need is the charge-offs and recoveries in an additive, a discrete additive way. That's the issue that we've had in adding, for example, agricultural production loans. We've had numerous requests to add the ag production loans into the CECLSolver. The challenge there has been, although balances are typically always been provided as a memo item for most institutions, charge-offs and recoveries and whatnot and other things that we need are only are only filled out on the call report by some banks. If you're over 300 million in assets, for example, and if you've had, or more than 5% of your portfolio is an ag. So that has been very challenging for us to have all the complete comprehensive data in order to add those additional segments. So we're limited by the segments we can get all that data for. And so that's why we chose the exact ones that we did on the tool.
Great. The next question, we're actually going to touch on validation here in a second. So I'm going to hold this one for a second and let Paul kind of just talk about some of the things he's been hearing and they're seeing. So Paul, I'll let you kind of share with the group here, what you've seen and what Saltmarsh has seen in the practice.
Okay. If we go right to validation,
we can save that. Yeah, do you want to go to that slide?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, we'll save that.
Well, then, so we do a number of CECL reviews. Some people call those internal audit reviews. Some people call them model validations. But it is an external look at how the institution is preparing and dealing with the CECL implementation. And so we'll talk about that a little bit in the course of those reviews and in talking with our clients in terms of what the issues are. The good news, Sean, is that most people have moved into CECL and have done it for a few quarters, and there's starting to be I want to say maybe a calming about the anxiety of getting that done. There's still some discussion and questions about how frequently should we revisit our qualitative factors, especially as we get new and updated economic information in. Perhaps one of the biggest areas that we continue to get questions and have some confusion about and some angst about is the whole issue of the unfunded commitment reserve. We've always been somewhat cognizant and tracking, and in audited footnotes, we disclose the level of loan commitments that we have outstanding, but we did not, prior to CECL, actually book or estimate a reserve on those commitments. So that is a relatively new area. We don't have a lot of data historically to show how many unfunded commitments actually get funded. And so there's some question about the estimate of the funding. And then there's a question about, well, once we fund those commitments, is there any difference in the credit risk related to those unfunded commitments as they come online? And if we're going to fund those, maybe into the second half of this year or next year, should we think about that differently because of the perception that economic conditions change? For the most part, folks are simply taking their unfunded commitments, applying an estimate of what they think they will fund, and then applying the loss factors that are in those loans that are funded and multiplying that through. But we do still have a few banks that say, well, I'm going to carry an excess in my ACL, and I think that'll be enough for my unfunded, and kind of waiting for criticism from their auditors or regulators of why do you not have a separate unfunded commitment reserve. So in my humble opinion, Sean, I think that will continue to get some discussion and attention as we move through and as institutions get more and more comfortable about that estimate. I hate to point this out, it's so obvious, but we're booking an estimate of losses on our estimate of what loans we may actually fund.
Right.
So it's one thing for us to book a reserve on the loans we have funded. We have a pretty good feel for those. Now we're projecting what unfunded commitments we'll actually fund and what the loss reserve may be on that. So I think that's going to be an area that if I were a bank CFO, I'd be booking something the best I can that seems reasonable to the management team, but I would probably be revisiting that periodically and probably asking a lot of questions of my auditors and examiners about, is what we're doing consistent with what you're seeing at other institutions and so forth. So we know the mechanics. We know what the CECL pronouncement says about unfunded, but actually putting that into practice is an art, not a science at this point. So I encourage you to talk a little bit about that. And that kind of leads into that second item. We're seeing quite a diversity in practice about how much documentation or discussion in board minutes and risk committee or audit committee minutes about CECL. And I would just encourage banks to perhaps put a little bit more conversation in the minutes about how the discussion went, and that the board understands the subtlety of some of these key issues, like the unfunded, what we're doing about that, and so forth. Unfortunately, we're seeing a few that just the minutes say the CECL report was presented. End of discussion. And that's probably not going to be enough for most regulatory agencies. They'd like to see some commentary about, any questions the board asked, and have some evidence in the board minute documentation that there was actually a conversation and discussion and questions and answers about it. So I think that's natural. It's a new thing. But I think that probably we could do a little bit better job on documenting the conversations in the board minutes. And following that, another area that we've kind of worked so hard at getting the CECL calculation done for the first few quarters and so forth, but we don't really have robust policies and procedures. Probably we probably have one or two people in the bank that know how to do it and have access to the model. We haven't talked a lot about backup and what the process is, and so we're starting to see more commentary and recommendations about a more formalized process. In other words, what are your practices and procedures? One or two people might just intuitively know how to get that and where the reports come from, but there's not a documented procedure and so forth. So there's a little bit of discussion that while the model vendors have documentation of the process, sometimes the institution needs some to how they actually do it internally, and who does it, who's responsible, and who the backup would be. And so those are a few observations that we're seeing that might need a little bit more attention. The good news, Sean, is that we're not seeing a lot of issues that, hey, you're doing it wrong. We're not seeing mathematical, it's just wrong. It's that, okay, we kind of got started, we have a reserve, we're doing a calculation, and now we're probably going to be asked as banks to back that up with better documentation and a little bit more policy and procedure being established. So those are the areas that we have. And Sean, I'm really pleased that I'm not telling you that the findings and recommendations we're having are that the reserves are simply wrong or mathematically not supported or something like that. I think we've gotten past that. And so now we're getting into the areas where we need to just develop this into develop the muscle memory and develop the support around the CECL process.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's great to hear, and I would concur. Right, I think our audience, right, as you said, right, they've kind of tackled the science part of it, right? That they've done the mechanics, they've got the reserves, calculated, building comfort, muscle memory, as you said, with that, and now, like you said, now it's a little bit going back and refining process, painting around the edges, adding, as you pointed out, better board documentation. Really kind of, laying out what that process is for a third party to understand what's going on, but then also even within your bank, as you said, right, to have backup preparedness. I think which all makes sense, right? We had to kind of tackle the process first, or just getting the mechanics of it getting done, and now we'll refine our processes and improve them, moving forward. So that's good to hear. From your point of view, I think from our point of view, we certainly felt like our banks had gotten comfort with just the getting the reserve calculated, but as you said, right now it's kind of tightening everything up.
Yeah, not just to dig a little deeper, just to look forward into 2024. We all talk about the fact that we think the economic conditions are probably changing over 24. Depending on your view about what the Fed will or will not do for the rest of the year, and depending on your view of your local economy and the national economy, as well as, global trends, it's very likely that the bank will have to be responding to different kinds of economic data and conditions. And so what's the process going to be? It's one thing to develop those assumptions, for the first time you implement them, but what will be your process on a quarterly or monthly basis, whatever your time frame is? Who's gonna, what's gonna trigger that thought process? Who's gonna discuss it? Is it gonna be discussed in the minutes? How frequently should you look at that? Should you look at national trends or local trends? If you look at the earnings releases for large public banks that are coming out of 12/31, you're seeing a lot of discussion, as you mentioned, Sean, about CRE and C&I credit metrics. But a lot of those metrics are moving badly or in an adverse position in large urban markets on very large commercial properties. And so those metrics may not, in fact, be moving as quickly or in as large an adverse move in local and community markets. So you got to be a little bit careful. So I guess I would just challenge CFO, how are you going to address that? It may be that you have a very good, clear idea of what you want to do, but is that communicated to the board or the audit committee or the risk committee? Is there a discussion of that? So, I mean, I would kind of suggest everybody ought to brace themselves, because we don't know when the shoe's going to drop, but we're going to see some movement in economic conditions probably in 2024. And I think there's a strong regulatory expectation that as those economic conditions change, they're going to want to see banks changing their assumptions. And so how are you going to do that? When are you going to do that? What's going to trigger it? What's going to be the conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And actually, in our webinar on Wednesday, David, we kind of pointed that out, right? That, on the one hand, asset levels and long-term asset levels at banks are at near all-time highs, and the reserves are kind of at historic lows. And so, again, emblematic of the fact that we've had, just pristine and stellar credit quality. But as you said, right, this year it might change, right? That the expectation might change, and our expectations around our reserve probably, should reflect that in some way, or at least be prepared to defend if it doesn't.
Well,
all right.
That last bullet point was on model validation, and we are getting lots and lots of questions. To be honest, there's confusion by examiners, by auditors, by institutions. So let's talk a little bit about that. The CECL model is kind of a participation sport. You've hired a vendor, and they are providing you a model. And so the vendor can provide information and documentation about how the vendor has satisfied themselves that the model actually works as represented. In other words, 2 + 2 = 4. Every time you put a 2 and a 2 in there, it's going to equal 4. That typically is documented in a form of a SOC 1 or SOC 2 type report. Something that an independent party outside of the vendor has hired. That independent party has looked at the model, has looked at the process and the procedures within the model vendor, and has issued some form of a report. So that will get you part of the way in terms of the fact that the model inside the box, the math works. But there's a lot more to that model validation, because if we know the model works in an abstract sense, how do we know the model works in your institution? And so someone's got to make sure that the data for that bank is going into that model. The assumptions that are in the model are the ones approved by the appropriate governance, and that the output is being given to the right person, to the right entity. And so, you can see the major aspects. Data integrity, that can't be done by the vendor because, the vendor can't hire a company to go out to every single client and make sure that that client's general ledger, loan trial, and so forth is going in. So that's up to the institution. So you've got to have somebody making sure that we're getting the right data in, it's being mapped correctly. The key assumptions are the assumptions approved and determined at that institution, the ones that are actually being used for the CECL calculation. Again, happens at the bank. Model process integrity, that can be done by the vendor. The vendor can hire someone and have a SOC 1 or SOC 2 or some form of report like that to say, hey, the model will process the data that you give me the way that I say it will. And then finally, someone has to be checking to make sure that, God bless them, the person who's running the model at the bank, if the report comes out and it looks horrible and they just stick it in their desk and don't present anybody, that's the problem. That's an output control, right? So, so when we talk about model validation, there's a portion that has to be done at the institution, either by someone in the institution that's independent and can do it without violating independence. They're not checking their own work, or most commonly, institutions hire their internal audit firm to do that. And then there's a portion that the model vendor can do, but those things together make up our model validation. And Sean, I'm afraid that there's a few people that just think, well, you get a model validation. Well,
Right.
You get a model validation at the vendor level, at the model, by the vendor at the model, and then you get a model validation of how that model is actually being implemented and run at the institution. And that one's unique to every institution. Is that helpful at all to talk about?
Yes, very, because I think that's the point. I think we've tried to emphasize and reinforce is there's only so much we can do for model validation. And so in our instance, we have our SOC 1 available to all of our institutions that they can see. Steve has put together an Excel tool to help independently validate the math in addition to that. But as you pointed out, there's pieces of what the bank is responsible for doing that we cannot do for them. So typically, again, and you can speak to it better than us, oftentimes they might hire a firm like yours or have someone in their institution who's independent of the process confirm those things. I mean, are those two of the acceptable ways or most popular ways that banks kind of tackle this? That second piece of it?
Yeah, and the problem for a lot of community banks is the only people that are competent to actually do that checking are involved in the model. So sometimes it's difficult to find somebody that's independent within the bank. So a lot of times that is an outsourced internal audit review. And by the way, this isn't new. We have model validation and interest rate risk. If you have a liquidity model, if you have an anti-money laundering alert to case model, that model has to be validated. So this is not a new concept. It's just perhaps we may be talking about it with a group of people who are doing CECL that may not have necessarily gotten involved in this and other things. We're increasingly using models in banks. And so all examiners and auditors are getting training on this buzzword model validation. And so, you have to be a little careful with that.
Yeah, and it is, and I think you've said in the past that a lot of this typically occurs in the implementation of a new model. So
yes,
it's heightened right now because obviously CECL and the ACL and CECLSolver is new at an institution, so it's the prime time, if you will, for that to be for the bank to be asked about doing this, given the entry point, if you will. for the
Yeah,
for the
and
tool.
that's a good point. You know, once this becomes a little bit more of a mature process, the internal audit type, the bank side of the model validation may not necessarily need to be done every single year. In other words, if you've continued to use the same model and the controls are still in place about who accesses that and so forth, it may be that you could rotate that out, you know, every other year or something like that. And that's true of all models. We generally do a model validation when it's implemented, if there's any significant change. And if none of those are happening, we probably do it periodically to make sure that people are still doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Great point. This slide just kind of reemphasizes kind of that bifurcation of responsibilities, you know, of what we can do as the vendor, but then what's, you know, kind of incumbent upon the bank and the management team to kind of handle. So I know our questions are building up here. I'm going to have Paul go through this final slide, and then we'll address the outstanding questions that are building up there.
Yeah, just want to point out that there are internal controls that are related to the use of a model, CECL or any other model in the bank. And so, you know, you have to be thinking about these controls. You know, obviously, if you put a CECL model in place at the bank and then you leave it available to everybody and the janitor comes in at night, kind of bored, messes around with the model because your keyboard's up, that's a problem, right? So we generally limit access to that model to make sure that no one's changing things. The second bullet point is what the vendor does to make sure that the vendor doesn't just allow any of their employees to change anything within the model. So we have change controls within the model. Who can put, you know, the data into the model, garbage in, garbage out, who's that model inputs, how can change assumptions. We want to see governance. So, you know, are those assumptions and so forth the way that it operates? Is there a connection to the governing committee of the institution? And then, you know, what about model outputs? Just basic output control. Who gets the data once the reports run so that they can make appropriate decisions and so forth, especially when you have out of policy conditions, right? We want to make sure that, you know, maybe the CECL model says our reserve should be higher and our general ledger is a little bit lower. Well, that needs to be reported to the board to make sure that that's reasonable and within the risk appetite of the institution.
Great.
These controls are useful for all models.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. All right, so let's pause here and go grab some of these questions. So hopefully the first one we've answered here, going through an FDI exam, show the Excel tool, need a model validation of the model from a third party that your company hires to check the number crunching. So again, we provide that SOC 1. It's under the blue CECLSolver resources. I would start there. If that is not satisfactory, then, you know, reach out to us and we will work with you to make sure we satisfy what the FDIC is looking for. Next up, what's the range of cost you see on external audit or model validation for a 200 to 500 million asset size community bank? I don't really have, you know, much to add there. I don't know if there's anything you can share, Paul, or how kind of
well, it's, you know, depending on what part of the country you're in and so forth, depending on what size firm it would be more comfortable to just say that the budgeted hours for that's usually something that can be done in 3 to 5 days, or, you know, approximately a week worth of work. Sometimes you can do it a little bit shorter than that if it's a real small institution, very straightforward. But I would just look internally and look at your other internal audit reports and reviews and so forth and say, this is probably, if I was going to budget, I'd budget a week, and then maybe it would be a little bit less. You know, maybe you could get a little bit less if you're smaller, but it's probably going to be about a week's worth of work. So 40 hours at whatever your external firm charges you on an hourly basis. That would be how I would budget that.
Perfect. That's really helpful. Thank you, Paul. This was a question I probably should have caught earlier. What if our unfunded commitment usage has been decreasing? How would you approach that in CECL calculations? Steve, you want to take that?
Well, I mean, using as far as how the tool works, which is how I would suggest doing it. There's one of the inputs that you plug in there is your current assumption of likelihood of funding, and if that number is lower, you're necessarily going to see a smaller ACL on the unfunded commitment. And so, if you have a different expectation of what's going to how much of something is going to fund, then you're going to have inevitably a different expectation of the potential loss you might have on the amount that ends up being funded down the road. So you end up with a decrease in the reserve in the ACL for unfunded commitments on the liability side of the balance sheet, and on the income statement, it's a small, slight reverse provision, so to speak, for ACL on the income statement. So while typically a lot of institutions don't like having negative provisions and just kind of keep the extra and then it'll slowly run off as you have slight losses. It doesn't work that way with unfunded commitments because you'll never have a loss on an unfunded commitment. So you'd have, if you wanted that to be accurate and match the tool, and you're changing an input or assumption into the tool by decreasing the likelihood of funding, the only result of that is going to have to be a slight negative provision on the income statement just for the unfunded commitments part, which will get watered, completely overdone, most likely overshadowed by the provision for the loan portfolio that you'll still have, and it'll probably be positive on the income statement. Paul?
I was just going to say, we're encouraged under CECL to revisit the reasonableness of assumptions and economic conditions every time we run CECL every quarter. And so if you can show that your unfunded utilization factor is going down, that would be your documentation. So you would change that assumption to reflect that reduction. So in the math, that would be the unfunded times a current, in this case, lower utilization factor. But obviously, you're probably going to need to document that because you may get questions. Why was it here in a previous quarter and down here? And you'd say, well, this is, I didn't make it up. Here's the utilization information that we have. So it's okay to change that. In fact, that's the whole point. You're supposed to be bringing that to current information every time you have an opportunity to.
But that's an easier one to justify as well, because you're not changing your assumption of loss rate on the funded amount, right? You're not saying, I expect less losses on this $1 million of loans than I did before, which is needs kind of more justification. It's simply, we're utilizing less, we're seeing less conversion into actual loans. Therefore, even at the same loss rate, we expect to see less losses in this bucket, in the unfunded bucket on the liability side, and therefore we're going to have a slight negative provision to bring it down a little bit.
Yep.
Next question is our internal audit asked if we were going to present an annual CECL analysis to the board. What exactly should be documented in that?
So if you think about, what you're asking the board to say grace over, you have a policy that talks about CECL, who does it, and so forth. So periodically I'd update my board and remind them, this is our approach. We're using, in this case, CECLSolver as a model. This is what we've done in terms of due diligence about that vendor selection. And then I talk a little bit about who runs it at our bank. And I'd talk a little bit about our reserve. Personally, I would show the allowance for loan loss as a percentage of loans prior to CECL and then after CECL to see what kind of impact the CECL process or implementation made. And then I would probably show the ACL as a percentage of loans compared to peer. So I would be trying to get the board comfortable with our process and to know that we are consistent with any policy or risk appetite expressed by the board, and that our process itself has, is reasonable compared to peer data. And then finally, if, periodically when you have a model validation or a review, or after an examination or audit, if there were any comments about the CECL or the allowance, I'd report those to the board at that time too, in that summary. So again, it's like any other functional area of the bank. Periodically, probably annually, you're going to be talking about with the board, hey, this is a big issue in the industry and this is how we're addressing it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Is CECLSolver acceptable once you're over $1 billion? Yes. I mean, the answer is yes. We have banks over $1 billion currently using it. You know, again, I think with anything, a question like this really is probably more focused around your portfolio. You know, if you have a traditional portfolio, not, you know, terribly highly concentrated, you know, it's certainly going to be acceptable. If it's something a little bit more unique or specialized, then, you know, then perhaps there might be areas where there needs to be more. Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
That's exactly how I'd answer it. You know, the methodology that you use for CECL is more closely aligned to the complexity and size of your loan portfolio and the types of loans you're making than it is total assets.
Perfect. Thank you. I provided the SOC 1 to the examiners, but they still want to see further model validation of the program itself to make sure the math works. Thoughts on how to respond to the examiners. So in previous presentations, you know, we referenced the Excel tool that Steve has built where you can independently put in all the information that you're putting in the CECLSolver as a way to reconfirm the math, if you will, beyond what's done in our SOC 1. Steve, I think have you made a YouTube video on that, or have we put anything out there like that regarding that?
I'm trying to think if we put it out as a separate clip, but if not,
Yeah.
it's something that
we could look
that
into. But
yeah.
starting point is again, if you look under the CECLSolver resources at the bottom, there is a link to an Excel tool that Steve built to essentially address this very issue. So you can certainly circle back with us after the or your salesperson after the webinars today, and we can try to make sure you've got understand how to utilize that. External audit has asked for an updated SOC 1 and bridge letter. We do have a more current SOC or bridge letter, excuse me. We can get that sent out to you. Again, just email customer service or your salesperson. We'll get that to you. We do have our SOC starting again in May, so we'll have a new SOC out here. You know, certainly I would hope by the end of June, if not sooner. So you can look for that, but we can update the bridge letter until that's complete.
Sean, we actually do have a video specifically on the Excel-based historical loss data calculation tool.
We do. Okay.
Yes.
Yep. Is it something they can access, or do they need to email the sales team or service team?
We'd have to send them a link right now.
Okay. So yes, so we can send you a link to that. So perfect. Thank you, Steve.
Yep.
We use an interest rate risk model from a third party, and they provide a validation document from an independent firm. This is what they're looking for. Yes. I mean, and we use ours is a SOC 1. That's what we presented or prepared to provide to our banks. So I guess in our case, that's our equivalent, if you will.
Yeah, there still seems to be the confusion between saying, well, you've given us a SOC 1, but you haven't given us a validation document. A SOC 1 is a type of there isn't one validation. I think, as Paul was saying, it's not validation with a capital V, right? It's a lowercase v, and there's multiple parts of validation. One of those parts can be provided by us, and that is we've determined what's appropriate for us to provide is the SOC 1. So that is part of the validation process. We've added some additional tools that can help if your institution were to hire somebody independent of the process, so independent of us and independent of anyone at your bank that is part of the ACL calculation process, that a third party, let's say, not someone internally, to do additional validation on how your institution is calculating and using the tool and how the math works for your specific institution. That's not something we can provide, because we'd have to provide it independently for every single institution that uses the tool, right? We can do it on a generic basis, which is what our SOC 1 does. Our SOC 1 does validate that the math works correctly and meets industry standards. For you to validate that the tool is pulling the correct data from the call reports from your institution and doing the correct math for your institution, that's something that a third party that you would hire if you didn't do it internally would have to provide. And that's where I created that Excel-based tool in order to help anyone in your organization or any other third party you hire to do a different part of validation for you. They can utilize that to make their job easier. Just another way to say it, I guess.
Great. Thanks, Steve. The next question is, who are the governing entities you're referring to? Paul, I assume you're talking about the board and just different management committees within the bank, correct?
Right. Different banks call those committees different things. So some banks have a board and an audit committee. Some banks have a risk committee that looks over that. Some banks have a management risk or management credit committee. So in your institution, whoever is governing the allowance for loan loss policy and the procedures, that's really what I was talking about to your respective governance.
Perfect.
Entity.
Thank you. The next question is, wouldn't your external auditors go over your CECL calculation as part of your audit?
Well, that's an interesting question. Obviously, within materiality of your balance sheet, but remember, an external auditor can't perform a management function. So management is responsible to make sure that the financial statements are correctly prepared and the process and procedures are in place. So you can't, as a member of management, say, well, my allowance must be good because no regulator or examiner or auditor has taken exception to it. Management is supposed to, satisfy themselves. So you have to be a little careful about putting reliance on an external audit firm. The external audit firm is going to be asking you, do you have internal controls? And how are you monitoring and make sure that those internal controls are in place? That's not the external auditor's responsibility, that's management's. So we have to be a little bit careful there. Management can certainly consider if they've had external audit comments or examiner comments, but at the end of the day, management is responsible to make sure that the books and records and financial statements are properly prepared and fairly presented.
Perfect. Great answer, Paul. Thank you, Michelle. We had an FDIC exam last year and they did not require us to have a model validation. When we priced it, it was around $5,000, maybe because our asset size is under 400 million. So just as a comment related to an earlier
somebody
question.
left a comment with that. Someone else made a comment on that exact range as well in the comments section, Sean.
Great. Thank you, Steve. During our current FDIC exam, they are telling us that we don't need to move the unfunded up and down each time if model shows that. In other words, they are saying we can have a range for this amount. Thoughts on that advice? Well, if it came from the FDIC, it must be right.
I think Paul's going to use the word materiality here, but go ahead, Paul.
Yeah.
I would probably say materiality there. So, let's make sure we understand the whole CECL calculation, whether we're talking about the unfunded liability or the ACL itself, is an estimate. And so I guess the examiner is saying, as long as we think your range is reasonable, maybe you don't have to move it up and down $2 or $3 every time you run the calculation. I would probably check with my external auditors and also probably talk to my board and make sure, hey, do you want to see me book to the exact dollar of the requirement? Should we have a little bit extra just to be on the safe side? Should we be within a range? That's up to every bank to determine what they feel materiality is for their institution.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think we've talked a lot about materiality in the past with Paul, and I think it certainly applies everywhere, but particularly in the unfunded commitments that we've just kind of discussed. Right, it's definitely a little more art than science at this point. There really has been no provincial, guidance laid down on how to handle it, and so I think materiality, should be at the forefront of almost all those conversations. Thank you for the comment about the Q factor matrix template. I'm glad to hear that that's helpful. We appreciate that. All right, let me get through those. Let's see what we have in the chat that I didn't get through here.
You can just start on the top. They're kind of they're not too much related to what we've already talked about.
We'll get a copy of the PowerPoint slides. Got a quote on validations, the bridge letter. You can request the bridge letter, the bridge letter. It's not where the SOC is, but your salesperson or just customer service, if you email in and ask for it, they can get you a copy of the bridge letter.
The current SOC 1 is located. Oh, she didn't see it. He didn't see it where the SOC 1 was located. Yeah, so he found the SOC 1. Okay, good.
Yeah. Could we see more details behind the pure historical loss data? Yeah, so this is, I mean, we understand the question. I think Steve has talked about in the past about how big this spreadsheet would be, but Steve, you want to touch again on just how big that spreadsheet would be?
That's something we can provide. And typically what we would do for that, just like if you're getting, validating any part of a tool that uses a model that uses a huge amount of data, or even doing an external audit, right? Loan review, right? If you're doing an external loan review, the external loan review firm is not going to take every single loan in the entire portfolio. It's going to have a sample size. And so the best way to handle something like the peer data, because if you go to our tool and you look at the historical analysis, there's a ton of information. There's hundreds of columns and rows and everything else at the segment level. The way you would do the calculation, the way we
just for your bank
for the peer is all the information that's required for CECL for an institution or an individual bank multiplied by how many banks are in the peer group. So if you have 200 banks in the peer group, we're talking about, I don't know, 10 million data points plus or minus. But that just because there's a lot of data doesn't get you away from having to, if they ask you to validate it, you have to prove it. So what we suggest is reach out to us and then pick a particular scenario. Let's say a fourth quarter scenario, and you have a WARM of 7 years on your mortgage portfolio, on your first liens, and you have a look back period of 5 years. And in the scenario, it's showing a peer lifetime loss rate of 2.4%, whatever it is. You send us that information, and we'll send you a spreadsheet that has all the banks in the peer group and all of the calculation for that particular segment for that time frame. So it'll match exactly what is in the tool. So there'll be a ton of rows and columns depending on how long your look back period is and how big your peer group is, and it shows the math of exactly how we calculate the lifetime historical loss rate for the peer group from all the information from the individual institutions that make up that peer group. And that would allow you to, so they also have an interest in seeing, which banks in the peer group are having the most influence on the loss rates. So you'll see how the math is calculated there. It's a weighted average, right? So if you have a larger institution that has, we wanted to focus on what percent of loans, of total loans within your peer group institution, or sorry, your peer group have had losses in the past. 10% or 1% net charge-off ratio for a $50 million bank versus a $2 billion bank. You're talking about a very different amount of loans that have actually gone bad. So you'll see how the math works, and that'll help elucidate that that question.
Yeah, but just be mindful. This is, it's not a small undertaking. So, if you do need it, certainly understand it'll take us a little bit of time to turn it around. Secondly, the peer data is there for context. It doesn't directly impact the calculation. I know some banks use a higher of, so I understand the need to be able to validate that, but just understand, as Steve pointed out, why it's not, just something we can.
Yeah, it's not something that we could, it's not a tool that we could automate and give to you as part of a CECLSolver interactive tool, just because the amount of data that is in it. But upon request for a particular segment as a sample, we can certainly provide all that data to validate it.
Again, this is a slide we show often, just some of the updates and enhancements. One of the ones I want to talk about is one we've had requests for that we will be releasing this weekend. We've had, as part of the audit process, a number of institutions ask for a user management and access control, kind of feature within it. We had done this in QwickRate, but we had not done it with QwickAnalytics for a number of reasons. But nonetheless, because of the number of institutions who'd asked for this, we have put something together. So Steve, if you want to talk a little bit about what we've done. And I know we're getting up on an hour, so we'll probably run over here, but just want to talk through this.
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, you'll see so coming over the weekend, we're going to push this to live, so you'll be able to utilize this starting next Monday. Keeping in mind that if you don't want to utilize this, you're not going to see any changes, right? You're not going to you don't have to go in there and do a bunch of work authorizing people and setting up users differently than you already have. Everything will continue working that has been working as far as who has access to what. If you want more flexibility in managing that, come Monday, you'll be able to. And when you log into the tool, right up there on the top, you can click on your name there. Mine says Steve, and that'll have a little drop-down box, and you choose user management. And if you're not an administrator, if you're not the person on your account that sort of oversees the use of QwickRate and QwickAnalytics, you'll only be able to see your data. So you can change your email address, you can change some of your contact information, and you can see what roles or what authorizations that you have. If you are an admin, this is the fun part. If you go to the next slide, Sean, you'll now have access to a screen where you can see all the users that are using QwickAnalytics and QwickRate, whether they're administrative admins or not. You can change who are admins and who can manage it. You can see whether they have access to QwickRate, whether they have full access to QwickAnalytics, whether they have full access to the CECL tool, or only read-only access to the CECL tool. And that's goes back to the validation process that Paul was mentioning. We've had requests from institutions to say, hey, we have our auditor looking at the CECL tool. We don't want them to be able to modify anything in our scenarios. They don't want to be able to do it, and we don't want them to. And part of the validation process is to prove that they can't, right? And so now you'll be able to set them up as a user and say read-only access to CECLSolver. What that'll mean is they'll be able to see everything, but they won't be able to change anything. They'll have the list of the scenarios that have been created. They can click on a scenario, they can go throughout the tool on all the tabs and see everything, but all those areas where they can type in a number or change anything are grayed out. So it's a fully functional tool with no input possibilities for either permanent access for employees that you want to be able to see this, but not have the ability to change it, or externally for, let's say you're having a validation done and you want to provide that additional third party with limited access for a period of time. You create a new user for them, you give them read-only access, and you can remove it or inactivate them at any time. Did I miss anything in there, Sean?
No, I think that's great. So this is, again, something we'll certainly touch on again next month. The auditing validation tool, this is, again, a screenshot of what Steve has put together. Again, this can be found in the CECL resources blue button. If you click on it at the bottom, there's a link to this auditing tool. It is a parallel to the solver, in the sense of it again is a way to independently validate the math that's being done in CECLSolver. The industry credit and analysis is information we showed again last month. I think there's a couple of questions I want to get to. The add-on software allows you to calculate by quarter your own bank's historical loss, correct? Yes, I think, Steve, the answers to that is yes, isn't it?
The add-in software allows you to by quarter your own. Yes, absolutely. The Excel add-in software allows you to pull anything, any field in our entire database for any institution over any periods of time. So it's the mother lode of flexibility from our platform standpoint.
The next question is, the Q factor labels are easy to edit and name. Good. Is it possible to edit the name column of the economic factor? Yeah, that tool really is, you can edit it and customize it however you want, right? We built the matrix to really kind of get you started, but you can certainly take it.
Well, this was, I think, just the Q factor columns on the interactive tool. They just want to relabel the economic column something else.
Oh, well, you could add another column and just name it whatever you want. Yeah, you do have the ability to the far right. There's a plus button you can add.
But if you want to use it as an economic column, as it's already sort of labeled, but you just want to tweak the label, there's no way to tweak that existing. It's a static label, but you can always zero it out and add your own custom column and do it that way.
Great. And so before we start here, I just want to remind us, we ended the kind of the validation thing. One of the slides at the end is that Paul's firm, Saltmarsh, is available if you do need a third-party validation. So Again, we're running it late on time, and I know some people are going to have to drop off. So we're going to continue on here, but I just wanted to let everyone know that there is a slide at the end of the deck. If you do want to reach out or you need a third-party firm for validation, Paul won't say it, but I'll say it. They're a great firm to work with. They do perform validations. They have familiarity with the CECLSolver. So if you are looking for a firm, Paul's contact information is at the back. Okay, Steve, if you want to talk a little bit about some of the trends here that you've put together.
Sure. So this, we always like to give some additional data about what we're seeing as far as credit quality trends and emerging ones, and show it a little differently each time, depending upon who's in the audience. This time I decided to look, we're talking about maybe the beginnings of some sort of new credit cycle, some deterioration in some areas of the portfolio. And the first place where that would show up on the call report would be in 30 to 89 days past due, right? That's the first indicator, leading indicator of deterioration of credit quality that we see on the call reports. And so I used the Excel add-in tool to pull all the banks in peer group 5, which is what? There's about 1,250 banks. Yeah. A quarter of the banks in the United States are in UBPR peer group 5. And I took end of 2001 or 2021, end of 2022, and then the most recent 4 quarters, and looked at 30 to 89 days past due by some of the more significant loan segmentation, and showed median and 75th percentile. So the areas where we see the highest losses, or highest 30 to 89 days kind of leading indicators, we've certainly seen a jump, not a jump, but an increase, a notable increase in the 4th quarter of 2023 in 30 to 89 days past due, kind of across the board for the most part. The highest levels of past dues are consumer loans, not a big surprise, and in 1 to 4 family, total 1 to 4 family residential. And so we show median values and how they've kind of they're all at their highest level in the last few years right now. They're not crazy high by any means, but they're certainly higher than the almost negligible levels that we've seen over the last decade. And we also show the 75th percentile there, because that kind of tells you it's not just where the median, the 50th percentile is, but the banks that are starting to have problems, how much problems are they having, right? Where are the problems getting worse for those that have some issues in certain segments? So you can see 1 to 4 family at the 75th percentile has jumped up from 71 basis points at 9/30 to 95 basis points at 12/31. That's a 25% increase in 30 to 89 days past due for 1 to 4 families at the 75th percentile. Multifamily still negligible. Construction land development right now, we're not seeing much. Again, it's a large national peer group, but we're certainly seeing that increase in consumer loans, which isn't surprising. And C&I has been kind of slowly, inevitably trekking up from negligible to a little higher than negligible. So we thought that might be a helpful way to look at those recent trends. John or Paul?
Yeah, no, that fantastic, Steve. Paul, I don't know if you have any comments on that or anything you're seeing.
Yeah.
And then these next couple slides we'll go through quick. We've shown them the last couple times here. This is not publicly available data that you can get from our add-in or from any publicly available source. We've gotten to a point in utilization of our tool where we have a significant portion of the community banks around the country using the CECLSolver. And one great thing that we can provide as a result of having so many active users like you guys is to look at all the scenarios that have been built and look at all the segments that have been built over the last year or so, and look at some trends. So trends in the proprietary CECLSolver user scenarios. And we see, a total ACL to loans there at the median level in the 75th and 25th. Unfunded commitments, ACLs, just so you have an idea of what other people are doing using our tool and what kind of ACLs they're seeing for unfunded commitments. Health insurance securities still pretty much flatlined. Unfunded commitments have been trickling up, but still not a whole lot. I would say still about, despite almost 99% of the community banks in the country have some level of unfunded commitments, but only 55% have any sort of reserve for those unfunded commitments. So 45%, half the banks in the country that have unfunded commitments are still reporting 0 ACL for those unfunded commitments.
And so again,
And
more
of the same stuff. Just if
Yeah.
you're trying to get a feel for what warm levels other community banks are doing and what direction warms are going in and Q factors are going in at the segment level, using thousands and thousands of scenarios that have been run on our tool, this can give you some good guidance. And it'll help you justify some of the the levels of Q factors and some of the warms. It's nice. Obviously, you're calculating your own warms or having us help you with that. But the more data that you can get to know whether those seem reasonable and compared to peer trends is always helpful in the process.
Yeah, and again, I think one, this is great, Steve. But two, I think again, directionally, you can start to get a sense, right? If you start looking at the Q factors from the beginning of, and not the absolute amount per se, but the direction again, right? For a lot of these, they have ticked up, which is what you'd expect given CECL. And then in some cases, the warms have ticked up again with higher interest rates, not completely unreasonable, as borrowers tend to deal with the higher rates by maybe taking a longer amortization. So
and
again, directionally,
prepayment assumptions are going down, right? In mortgage portfolio 4 years ago, prepayment rates were 30% per year. They're like 9%. And so the prepayment assumption that goes into the warm is certainly lower in a rising interest rate environment, which all things equal leads to longer warms.
Yep.
Slightly longer, not massively, but certainly longer.
Yeah. So again, just another deep piece of information that we want to help give context to what you're doing. Just give yourself a comparison. So again, Steve will continue to prepare these, and we'll share these in the presentations. The questions were great today. As I mentioned, if you need help with third-party validation, Paul's firm's able and willing to help. So just a slide for that. Upcoming, as we've touched on, we are increasingly trying to put together, a warehouse of not only videos of these presentations that are available to you on a YouTube channel. You can see the link at the bottom, but we are going to increasingly try to create small, short videos to address a lot of customer service questions that we get on a repeated and regular basis. So
right inside the tool. So
inside the tool,
So we have a YouTube. We upload a lot of these videos to our YouTube channel, but there's a limited amount of organization we can provide since it's in YouTube, right? We're trying to create these video clip resources that reside right in the CECLSolver tool where you're having questions. So you can find them easily, watch a 2-minute video clip, and have a good explanation of something related to that particular part of the tool or parts of QwickAnalytics.
So that's really going to be something we're going to try to work on and improve for you as the year moves on. Just a reminder, we do have some upcoming webinars. One is around IntelliCredit. We had a question earlier in the presentation about getting more granular. This is a tool that can help you do that if you'd like. So one of the things we're going to begin offering this year is a 6-month free trial. Since it does involve more loan level data, it takes a while for you to kind of see the impact of having better information and access to your data. So we're willing to invest the time with you to demonstrate that to you and how valuable that can be. So again, you can learn more about this, but if you are interested in a trial, you can click on the link or just email us and we will get you started or talk about how to get you started. As I mentioned, we do have next Friday our first really loan data coffee talk. So again, this is going to be a complement to our CECL coffee talks, where we do talk about your loan portfolio, maybe in more granular detail, and how our tool might be able to help you and just things we're seeing. And then we'll be back in March for another CECL coffee talk, where undoubtedly we'll talk about validation some more. We'll talk about the new user management tool. We'll talk about any other updates or issues that we hear about in the next 30 days or so. So, Paul, Steve, any final comments for everybody before we let them go today?
No, thanks for the plug, Sean. I will point out to everyone that there's many great firms doing CECL reviews, and so I encourage you to check with your vendor for outsourced internal audit. And if you don't have one, we'd love to talk to you. But but certainly there's a lot of great firms out there, Sean. So thank you, but thank you for the plug.
Understood. And that's why I said Paul wouldn't say it because he's too modest, but yeah, they can help you. Steve, anything final for you?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for hanging on. I know we ran over, but the conversation today was great. Thanks again to our dear friend Paul Allen for joining us and making this a very good coffee talk as always. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
See you, buddy.